officer walks into a restaurant and guns down her partner in cold blood. But the real shock? She wasn't done yet. She circled back with her badge still on, ready to wipe out the last witnesses. And what drove her to kill? That's the most disturbing part of all. Antoinette Frank, a cop who crossed the thin blue line and left a trail of blood behind her. This is not just a murder case. It's a betrayal of trust, a failure of the system, and one of the most chilling cases in Louisiana's criminal history. When Antoinette Frank joined the New Orleans Police Department in early 1993, she seemed, on the surface, like exactly what the department needed. Young, driven, and a top graduate of her academy class, Frank fit the image of progress in a city desperate for change. New Orleans was plagued with corruption, racial tension, and a crumbling police force. The NOPD needed officers badly. So badly, in fact, that they ignored glaring red flags. Frank had failed 2 psychiatric evaluations. One of the doctors, Dr. Philip Scuria, explicitly warned the department not to hire her. She lied on her application. She lacked basic emotional resilience, decisiveness, and confidence under pressure. But none of that mattered. The city was bleeding out officers faster than it could replace them. Salaries were pitiful. Morale was lower than ever. And the push to diversify the force in a majority black city gave Frank an extra edge. So, on February 7th, 1993, Antoinette Frank was sworn in as an officer of the law. 3 weeks later, she graduated from the academy. From day one, her behavior was strange. Officers described her as shy, detached, and socially awkward, but there was something else, something hard to put into words, a coldness, a vacancy. One fellow officer later admitted she didn't know how to be a cop. Not really. She wasn't cut out for it. Supervisors tried to help. They suggested remedial training, extra oversight. She even earned a couple of community service awards that seemed more like PR than praise. But no one could have predicted what was coming. If you're already hooked and want to help support stories like this, drop a like and share this video. It helps more than you know. November 25th, 1994. Frank was on duty when she responded to a shooting victim, Rogers Lacaze, a young, smooth-talking drug dealer bleeding in the street. Most officers would have seen a suspect. Frank saw something else. Some say she wanted to save him. Others say she was just mesmerized. Whatever the reason, that night began a relationship that would spiral into chaos. At first, she claimed she was just trying to help him, to turn his life around. But soon, things got murky. She was seen letting Lacaze drive her personal car. Worse, he was spotted inside her squad car at a crime scene. She introduced him as her trainee, her nephew, or simply waved off the questions. But behind closed doors, things turned intimate. Frank and Lacaze were lovers, deep in a secret romance that had disaster written all over it. Frank ignored every risk, her job, her badge, her fellow officers. She knew who Lacaze was. She knew he dealt drugs. She knew he had been shot and possibly killed before, but she didn't care. In fact, some witnesses claimed the two began robbing people together, pulling over motorists in uniform, using her authority to steal. There was even an incident in February 1995, just a month before the murders, that should have raised alarms. Witnesses say Frank and Lacaze pulled over 2 men after a party, and during a violent altercation, Lacaze pulled a gun, a Tech-9. One of the men tried to flee. Another man, a civil sheriff, happened upon the scene. What he saw disturbed him. Frank in uniform, watching as Lacaze waved a weapon. But instead of stopping him, Frank vouched for him. Lacaze is the good guy. Let that sink in. A uniformed officer defending a known criminal with a gun mid-crime. The incident was never formally investigated. No charges, no reprimand, nothing. And less than a month later, 3 people would be dead. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. These cases only get darker, and Antoinette Frank's story is just beginning. It was a restaurant she knew well. Frank worked off-duty at Kim An, a quiet Vietnamese restaurant in New Orleans East. The Vu family, hard-working, tight-knit, had come to trust her. They'd let her in at all hours. She had a key. She was part of their circle, or so they thought. March 4th, 1995. Just after midnight, the restaurant was closed and the staff was cleaning up. Frank had already stopped by twice that night with laquais to grab some leftover food. It seemed harmless, but Chow Vu, the family's daughter, felt something was off. Frank's energy was different. When she returned a third time, this time alone, Chow knew something was wrong. Chow rushed to hide the restaurant's cash in a microwave. Frank entered using her stolen key and moved quickly, pushing Chow, her brother Kwok, and another worker into the kitchen. Officer Ronald A. Williams II, Frank's colleague and fellow security guard that night, watched the scene unfold and tried to follow. But before he could reach the kitchen, laquais emerged behind him and fired a bullet into his neck. Williams dropped instantly, paralyzed. Then came the second shot, then the third. He was executed point blank. Frank turned back toward the dining area. The massacre had only begun. In the chaos, Chow and Kwok dragged the other worker into the back cooler. They shut off the light. Silence. Hiding in darkness, they listened. What they heard next was pure horror. Frank and laquais was yelling at the Vu siblings, Ha and Kwong, demanding to know where the money was. But neither of them knew where Chow had hidden it. Frank pistol-whipped Kwong. Still no answer. She opened the microwave, found the cash, and then she executed Ha with 3 bullets. Kwong was shot 6 times. He died instantly. And then they left. But Chow and Kwok were still alive. Trapped in a freezer, they tried desperately to call 911, but couldn't get a signal. Eventually, Kwok slipped out and ran to a neighbor's house. The call was made, and that's when the nightmare turned surreal. Antoinette Frank was no longer at the scene. She had dropped laquais off and disappeared into the night. But when she heard the 911 call over her portable police radio, officer down at Kim An restaurant, she made her move. She didn't run. She didn't hide. Instead, she borrowed a police car and returned to the scene, posing as a responding officer in full uniform with her badge, armed. Her goal? Kill the remaining witnesses, eliminate Chow and Kwok. But fate had other plans. As she entered through the back door, Chow was at the front, waiting for help. When Frank emerged, Chow bolted toward the arriving officers, screaming, "You saw what happened. You killed my brother and sister." Frank tried to play it off. She claimed she had no idea what was going on. She even pretended to investigate, acting like just another cop on the case. But it was over. The survivors knew what they saw. The mask had slipped. Frank was arrested on the spot. laquais was picked up hours later. The evidence? Overwhelming. The motive? Revenge, greed, chaos. We're only halfway through this shocking case. If you want to see how Antoinette Frank's trial became one of the fastest death sentences in New Orleans history, and how she may now escape execution, while the city reeled from the triple homicide and detectives locked up Frank and Lacaze, another grim secret was quietly waiting, buried just beneath the surface. Literally. Back in 1993, nearly 2 years before the Kim On murders, Antoinette Frank had filed a missing person report. The missing man, her father, Adam Frank. She claimed he'd vanished without a trace after staying at her home for a short period. The case never made headlines, no searches, no follow-ups, just another lost person in a chaotic city. But the real horror emerged after she was already sitting on death row. In November 1995, a month after Frank was sentenced to die, a neighbor's dog began scratching obsessively beneath her house. Police investigated and found a human skull with a bullet hole in the back. It had been buried in the dirt under her foundation. Investigators suspected the skull belonged to Adam Frank. DNA testing was never publicly completed, but everyone from homicide detectives to prosecutors believed the truth was clear. Antoinette Frank had murdered her own father before she killed her fellow officer and the Vu siblings. Why? Well, here's where things get even darker. Frank had confided to psychologists and jailhouse interviews that her father had raped her repeatedly during her childhood. He was abusive, controlling, a monster in his own right, and Frank, they believed, had eventually snapped. She didn't just kill the man who abused her. She buried him right beneath her feet and told no one. And the state? They never even bothered to prosecute her for it. As one officer put it, "What's the point? She's already on death row." But death wasn't coming for her anytime soon. Not yet, because what came next was a trial that shocked even the most hardened courtroom veterans. The case against Rogers Lacaze moved fast. In July 1995, just 4 months after the murders, Lacaze was found guilty and sentenced to death. His biggest mistake, he used Officer Williams' credit card at a gas station minutes after the killings. But Antoinette Frank's trial, that was something else entirely. Her legal team subpoenaed 39 witnesses. How many did they actually call? 0. It was as if her defense team gave up before it even began. The trial lasted a week. The evidence was overwhelming. Survivors took the stand. Witnesses tied her to the murder weapon. Her confession, though later challenged, was detailed and damning. And the jury? They didn't even need a lunch break. 22 minutes. That's all it took to return a guilty verdict on all counts. It was a New Orleans record for a capital murder case. The next day, they deliberated the sentence. It took just 45 minutes to recommend the death penalty. Even the judge looked stunned. On October 20th, 1995, Antoinette Frank was officially sentenced to die by lethal injection. She was transferred to the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, where she would remain the only woman on the state's death row. Homicide detective Eddie Rance, who led the investigation, later said, "She's the coldest person I've ever met, and I've been doing this for 30 years. If stories like this leave you speechless, consider leaving a comment below. Should trauma excuse a killer's actions? Was justice truly served? We want to hear your thoughts. You'd think the story ends there, but it didn't. Because in America, death row isn't just a sentence, it's a long, brutal waiting game. Frank's attorneys launched appeal after appeal, arguing she had been denied funding for expert witnesses and was suffering from PTSD and childhood trauma. Psychiatrists testified that Frank had endured years of abuse and neglect, that her mind was fractured, and she wasn't inherently evil, but tragically broken. Others disagreed. A state psychiatrist diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial tendencies, traits common in sociopaths. In his opinion, Frank wasn't a traumatized victim. She was a cold-blooded manipulator. Despite these arguments, her execution was delayed multiple times. Death warrants were signed and revoked. Judges were recused. Questions about forged signatures and shady courtroom practices surfaced. And then came the twist. Politics. In 2023, Louisiana Governor John Edwards announced his opposition to the death penalty and advocated for its abolition. Sensing an opportunity, 56 of the 57 inmates on Louisiana's death row, including Frank, petitioned for clemency. The state parole board, however, wasn't interested. They rejected every single one. Antoinette Frank's clemency plea was denied in October 2023. But just when it seemed all hope had gone, everything changed again. In 2025, Louisiana introduced a new execution method, nitrogen hypoxia, and in March they carried out their first execution in 15 years. But Frank wasn't on the list. She still had one card to play. On April 28, 2025, her lawyers filed a new motion to overturn her death sentence, and this time the court listened. On May 15, 2025, a judge officially accepted her appeal and scheduled a new sentencing hearing for December 2025. For the first time in 30 years, Antoinette Frank has a real chance to escape execution. The state attorney general tried to intervene. The judge said no. So now, the woman who wore a badge, took innocent lives, buried secrets under her house, and became Louisiana's most infamous female killer, may never be executed at all. May never be executed at all. Antoinette Frank's story is more than just murder. It's about the failure of systems, policing, justice, trauma, and trust. It's about how a city ignored red flags and how the line between protector and predator was crossed in the most brutal way imaginable. What do you think? Should her sentence be overturned, or is justice long overdue? Drop your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling stories from Death Row Diaries. This case isn't just unforgettable, it's a reminder of just how thin the line between law and lawlessness can be.
Y'all get on over there and subscribe to Death Row Diaries if y'all like that story there. Got 14 videos up, and y'all most definitely. This the one here that came up next, right? Give y'all a little sneak preview. Alright, so y'all get on over there and sub the Death Row Diaries if y'all like that story. Peace.